Welcome to the Tudor Dixon podcast. This week, we are celebrating Martin Luther King Day, and I am pleased to have Alveda King here with me to chat about this amazing man who changed the course of history. Right before we get into the amazing life of Martin Luther King Jr., first, I want to tell you about American financing. It's 2024, and a lot of us are trying to get our finances in order, and there's great news for homeowners. Interest rates have finally dropped, and now they're in the fives, a lot lower than what you saw last year. And if you are buried in high-interest credit card debt, now is the time to break free. American Financing can help you access cash in your home to pay off your high-interest debt. Last year, their salary-based mortgage consultants helped customers save an average of $854 a month. That's like giving yourself a $10,000 raise. And what better way to start the new year? If you start today, you actually could delay 2 mortgage payments. Call American Financing today, 866-890-9313. That's 866-890-9313. AmericanFinancing.net. NMLS 182334, NMLS consumeraccess.org. APR rates in the 5s start at 6.406% for well-qualified borrowers. Again, call 866-890-9313 for details about credit costs and terms. And now I want to welcome in Dr. Alveda King to the podcast. She is the chair of the America First Policy Institute's Center for the American Dream and grew up in the civil rights movements. Her parents, A.D. and Naomi King, as well as her uncle, Dr. Martin Luther King, obviously were like the parents of the civil rights movement as well. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's such a blessing to join you and your viewers and your audience, your listening and viewing audience. Hi, everybody.
Well, I'm so excited. I got to tell you, when I was a kid and we first heard this story, I think that I grew up in a generation where when you're a child, you don't really understand that there was a time when there was segregation, when there was discrimination like that. And you hear the story in school where Martin Luther King as a child can no longer play with his friend. And still to this day, it brings tears to my eyes to think about that. And as a child, I remember thinking, how could that have ever happened? And I remember a few years ago, my daughter was probably that same age, and she came home and she said, "Mom, I have to tell you a terrible story." And I thought, wow, the power of that story through generations. Well, how neat is that? But now every day we hear about racism and how everybody's being torn apart. Tell us a little bit about what your parents and what your uncle would say today to kids who go, how could that have ever been the way it was?
Dreams, legacy, vision are connected and they're interconnected. And truths have to be told in every generation, every decade, on every platform. If we don't remember to teach truth, then people forget and history can repeat itself. The only answer to that is to continue to proclaim truth and to teach in every generation. And I even tell people today with social media, for example, in other countries, some of the things that's on our social media just would not be allowed. Children wouldn't be able to see it. And so we need to recapture these platforms. And that's what we're doing with this show, by the way. And that's very important, to ask the hard questions and to ask God for solutions. And as we do that, it happens. I know children say the same thing to me, even in my own family, my grandchildren, for example. And my grandson came and asked his mother, "Have you heard of Martin Lewis King?" And his mother said, "Well, how about Martin Luther King? And he's your great great uncle. How about that?" And he's a little fella's about 3. And we talk about family matters at home. The pictures are all over the house and everything. And yet when he went to school and it became an assignment, it captured his interest. So in every generation, decade, and platform, it's going to be very important. Racism is based in misinformation. It's a systemic issue. It's a human issue. It's not even Acts 17:26, and science says of one blood God made all people. So we're not separate races. We're one race with different ethnicities. That needs to be taught definitely in every generation and every decade. And so to begin to hate or dislike someone because of their skin color is not factual, it's not scientific, it's not God's will. And so those things need to be taught in every generation.
We hear about, I studied quite a bit in college. I took many African American studies classes, and I think I'm blessed to have done that because there is a history there that we don't necessarily learn automatically if we don't seek it out. And I think
That's
that
true.
when you are learning about that and you hear about the segregation and you hear about where Black people had to sit versus white people, and just that visual. I think having that in your head, that visual of really being able to see racism. Now racism is talked about as this boogeyman that's out there that you can't see, but there was a time when it was just acceptable to openly say these people are not welcome in the same place that we are welcome in. We've made a lot of strides since then because of your family. I mean, and really, this is because of your family that did this, that opened the eyes of people and the people that came around them, and so many people working together. But today, you made a good point at the beginning. You said that if you don't know history, it can repeat itself. We
That's
see
right.
some of these universities having separate college graduations and things like that. We see segregation happening again, and people are cheering it on as it's a good thing. What do you think when you see things like that?
I know there again that I'm not really doing my job or not doing it well. And this little thing keeps popping up. And the only way to overcome evil is with good and with truth. And so for instance, we're starting a new talk show, reality talk show called The Vision. It's a Christian show. I and five of my friends and young ladies, we're all together and we are proclaiming and answering. Now, Satan has a title, Prince of the Power of the Air, but it's just a title. The airways belong to us, but we don't know how to occupy the airways with truth. And
Mm.
so when I hear the misinformation, I always counter, I always answer with truth. And so even if you ask in the colleges and they're going to have the separate graduations for people according to skin color, the kids ought to say, we're not doing that. No, we're not going to do that. And the president of Harvard resigned recently after doing some anti-Semitic things and other kind of things and stirring up misinformation, causing people to be angry. And so it's truth that sets people free. And I have the same when peripherals collide, convergence is imminent. That's true for good things, but it's also true for bad things. And so we need to watch what we say, what we do, and to use our platforms wisely. And as when we do that, we see attitudes reverse, we see situations reverse. And I do that. I am blessed to access the airwaves in music, in film, in policy, America First Policy Institute, where I am the chairman for the Center for the American Dream. But I want to remind people that dreams and legacies can connect and we can overcome evil with good, but it takes work. We have to, on purpose, decide
Mm.
to say something kind instead of judgmental, for example. We see somebody doing something they shouldn't do. Oh, did you see that? And they need to be sat down and they don't talk to them anymore. That's the first person I want to talk to. And I want to ask those hard questions. And I want to offer opportunities of hope instead of fear and anger.
I mean, that seems like that was the mantra during the civil rights movement. It wasn't about being angry. I mean, there was anger, but it was more of a righteous anger, and there was a lot of love. The protests were to be done in love and in progress, and people were to be excited about that. Now there is so much anger, and I think part of that is that you talk about all these platforms, and honestly, what sells on these platforms seem to be the angrier you are, the more clicks you get. You can bring a lot more people in with that, I'm going to tell you something radical and you're going to get angry, than you can with, hey, let's be together. Let's bring unity. Why do you think Martin Luther King was so successful with unity?
My uncle, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, my granddaddy, Daddy King, his father, whose grandfather was from Ireland. Nathan Branham King's grandfather was Irish. Mama King's parents, her daddy was a slave preacher. Martin Luther
Mm.
King Jr. understood all of this. And this, if you read his writings, we must learn to live together as brothers. I'll add as sisters, and not perish together as fools. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. When you learn to value the human personality, you won't kill anybody. So that gives an attitude of a win-win situation. Everybody needs to win, womb to the tomb, beyond all of that. So you can have a win-win personality, but Martin Luther King Jr. was not born in a vacuum. That's legacy. That's generation after generation of these teachings. I'm 73 now. My mom is 92, and she's forever talking about unity, kindness. And so Martin Luther King Jr. did not grow up in a vacuum. He was raised in an environment where his parents and grandparents understood that they were people of destiny, people of legacy, and those dreams could be transmitted throughout the ages. And we do that, which hopefully you hear that when I'm talking too. Faith, hope, love, fear not, be kind. I'm not nice. I'm not a nice person, but I try to be very kind, because the Bible doesn't say be nice to one another. The Bible says be kind. And I try to do that. And so people always say, what would Martin Luther King Jr. say if he were here today? And I said, well, good thing he wrote many of the things he wanted to say down, like Abraham Lincoln did. Certainly the whole Bible, Genesis to Revelations, we don't have to say, what would God say? Just open the book and read it. So we can do that with Martin Luther King Jr. on his birthday, throughout the year. And it's very important that when we remember that Martin Luther King Jr., a very imperfect human being, like every human being is. Remember that when we remember him, and that will help us to understand what he would say today.
I think there's something that we are, I would say in many cases, we are afraid to talk about our history in this country, because I think people are afraid to say, man, we had slavery and it was really tough. I mean, this was the worst thing the country could have ever done, right? It was such a battle between these powerful men. And you see it from the very beginning. I mean, in the very beginning of the United States, from the time that the slaves started to be brought in, you saw men saying, this is wrong. We've got to stop this. And it took years, it took decades for people to actually stand up and really fight against it. But I think there's also a story about Black people that we don't talk about enough. Look at the perseverance. Look at what they were able to overcome and do in the United States of America, because it wasn't over when Abraham Lincoln signed that abolition of slavery. It wasn't over. It wasn't over when Martin Luther King was executed. And it's not over today. I mean, we have to be honest about the fact that we are always striving to be better. But man, there's a story of such strength in the Black people in this country, isn't there?
There has been a story, there is a story, and in every decade, generation, platform, it has to be retold. We have to look at the history and what was, and we have to consider what is. Dig a little bit and find out how various communities, various people, regardless of skin color, were able to come together. I have a book with Ginger Howard, a good friend, Ginger Howard. We Are Not Colorblind. And as we were writing the book, we compared our experiences. And in many ways they were different, and yet in many ways they were similar. So we look for differences, we look for similarities, we should celebrate those. And my mind won't automatically think, well, Black people think like this, white people think like this, Asian people think like this, Native Americans like this, Latinos like this. Of course, I celebrate absolutely all of that. But there is a phrase called human dignity. And we're all human beings. My uncle said, Martin Luther King Jr. said, we may have come over on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. So when you have those types of perspectives, it's easier to begin to kind of cross boundaries and be able to talk with each other and do things together. Age is another factor. I'm older than a lot of the people I work with. I'm 73. I work with people in their 50s and 30s and even younger. I passed the torch this year in the pro-life movement to a young girl, a young lady. So we need to learn to communicate across what we have perceived to be barriers, boxes, and labels. And we begin to do that and celebrate each part of all ethnicity. It's fascinating. Ethnicity should never divide us.
Well, and I say that because I think it's so important for people, young people of all colors, no matter what your background is, to understand what the Black community has gone through in the United States of America, because you see so many heroes. There are so many heroes in these stories. And if you really
There's
dig
so many,
in,
so
that's
many.
the amazing thing. And
It
that's
is.
what I think that is being robbed of our young people, to not see these beautiful stories of saving and persevering and just fighting in such a good, positive way. And how do we get that across? And I thank you so much for what
That's
you
our
do every
job.
day.
It's our job to bring it across. We have to do it because we should remember. And if we don't, let's go back and find it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, when I was in college and I was taking these classes, it was, I had grown up in Illinois and I went to college in Kentucky. So it was a different culture, I will say. And I walked into my first African American studies class and I was the only white student in there, and everybody just kind of like scattered away from me, right? And I sat by myself, and I remember going back to my dorm that night, and the two girls next to me, my girlfriends that lived in the room next to me, they were both African American students. And I went in and I said, "Hey, when I went to class today, no one would sit with me." And one of them looked at me and she goes, "Well, now you know how we feel every time we go to class."
You see?
Oh,
Yeah. But you probably
that
never thought
struck
about it.
me.
But there's another
Mm-mm.
lesson in that, which is really strange. And we missed that moment. Well, now you know how we feel. And then the repartee should have been, that happens to you too. So it's not just skin color. Wow, humans can really be mean, can't they? So
Oh
that's a
gosh, yeah.
moment to unite on the same point. And that's what Ginger and I do often. And I say, Ginger, I'll have to say that to her too, though, because I say, now you know how I felt when that happened to me, because she has had some things that happen. And she says, oh, wow, I never knew. And yet
Mm-hmm.
I will watch some things that happened to her. And I say, that was pretty mean what they did to you.
Mm.
So let's look for the differences and the similarities and begin to communicate and to value the human personality. Learn to live together not as separate races, because we're not. However, we will celebrate our ethnicities and try to get it together.
I hope today students still feel like they can go to their classmate next door who is a different background from them and be vulnerable, because I
I
think
pray
that's
so.
the time when
That's
you
good.
learn so much.
That's good.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Alveda King. We appreciate it. We celebrate your family this week, everything you've done, and where we've come as a country because of that.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us on the Tudor Dixon podcast for this episode and others. Go to TudorDixonPodcast.com. You can subscribe right there or head over to the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And join us next time on the Tudor Dixon podcast. Have a blessed day.